CGQ Plus.
So I mentioned in the last episode of Flashback that things were going to end up sort of taking a little bit of a dark turn. Not because necessarily the games that I was going to subsequently get were bad, although one or two of them definitely are, but just that I was disappointed in them. And I think part of the problem there was that the Legend of Zelda and Super Mario Brothers kind of set a standard, and I think that the subsequent games, for various reasons, sort of failed to live up to that. So, but I also said that I was going to talk about Toys R Us. And the reason for that is that the first game that we're going to talk about, the first game that I got, came from Toys R Us. So that was my first experience getting to go to Toys R Us and have that experience of buying a video game at Toys R Us, which was a little bit unique, I think. Toys R Us was really one of the only places that I could go to get video games that had a respectable selection. It was really, it was Toys R Us and KB Toys. Where I lived, like, we didn't have Best Buy and stuff like that. I didn't even know Best Buy existed until the mid-90s when we got one. And I was surprised to find out that Best Buy has been around sort of in its current form since the 80s, because we just didn't have that where I was. We had like Sears and we had Montgomery Ward's, like department stores where you could go to buy games. And really back then, all department stores did sell games, but Toys R Us really by far had the best selection of games. So that's always where you wanted to go. But on top of that, I mean, Toys R Us had the best selection of everything as far as toys went. I mean, it was a huge store. So I actually, I drew up a little like map or whatever. Like I'm trying to sort of recollect what Toys R Us was like when I was a kid. So I kind of was, doing stuff like this kind of helps me jog my own memory. But I also had a lot of fun doing it because it was sort of reminiscent of getting out graph paper and drawing out dungeons in like Dragon Warrior or something. We didn't live too far away actually from Toys R Us, so I used to ride my bike over there. It wasn't like walking distance, but it was maybe a mile and a half away, and so I could just get on my bike and go over there. So anytime I had money, I would usually go to Toys R Us. I was also really big into Legos when I was a kid. I don't know if you can see the Legos. Well, they're right there. That's like a fraction of what I have. But it was always hard for me to come up with enough money to buy a game, but I could always, get $5 or $10, go to Toys R Us, buy some Legos. So those are the places I would always hit when I went to Toys R Us. I'd go to the video game aisle and I would go to the Lego aisle. So the way it worked when you went to Toys R Us, you'd go in the entrance, at least at the one where I grew up, and it would sort of like funnel you. It's kind of like going to IKEA or something. It would like funnel you. You have to go this way and through this stuff just to kind of get into the main part of the store. And where it was funneling you was like, it was almost like not impulse items, but it was like seasonal items. Like if you went there in like the late spring or early summer, it would be like inflatable pool toys and like snorkels and flippers. And if you went there kind of later in the summer, that's when it would turn into being like back to school stuff, which was always a punch in the gut. When it got to be like late July, early August, which really is still like in the middle of your summer vacation, you'd start seeing like the back to school ads in the newspaper, and then you'd go to like beloved Toys R Us, and here was like this huge back to school display with like, pencils and pads and notebooks and trapper keepers and backpacks. And so you had to walk through that. And so like I would walk through that stuff, and you would turn right coming out of there, and boom, you'd be in the video game section. Like the first aisle, at least when I was a kid. Later they had like the R zone or whatever, but when I was a kid, that's not how it was. This first aisle on the right-hand side had like unboxed game systems and home computers. The kinds of home computers they would sell at Toys R Us, which would be like the Commodore 64 or 8-bit Atari systems, like probably like the Atari XE. Not in a way that they were running, but just so that you kind of see what came in the box. And they would have like these plexiglass things over the top of them that obviously you couldn't take off. So that nobody could play with them, but you could just see them. And then later, they took out those shelves and they put in like these full height glass cabinets. And I wish I could find a picture of those. And that's just kind of like where they would put like high dollar electronics items. but they would also put like unboxed game systems in there. And I remember that being the first place, and really probably the only place, that I saw a Neo Geo system. Like they had the Neo Geo AES like unboxed. But anyway, so that was like the very first aisle, like the outer aisle. And then if you went just one in, that's where all the video games were. And the way it worked at Toys R Us was it would have these things. They were like, I think they were called VidPro cards, or maybe this predated VidPro cards, but they didn't actually have any of the games out for you to like, they didn't have like the actual game box. They would just have like the box art on like this card, and then right below each one of those cards was like this plastic sleeve that was clear in the front, and that sleeve ideally would have these paper tags inside of it that would have like the name of the game and the price. And if you wanted that game, you would take one of those tags. Usually when I went in there, and this is really true, I would say throughout the heyday of the Nintendo, most of the good games were out of stock. Like if you went there to get like Super Mario Brothers 3 or Castlevania or Contra especially, it was just always out of stock. So you were kind of you'd sit there and you'd be looking. It kind of reminds me now when I go to the store to buy beer, because I like trying different kinds of beer. And so I'm just like sitting there looking at the whole beer case, just like I'm like paralyzed. And that's kind of how it was back then, because, you know, you'd be looking and it's like there were all these games to choose from. And then you had to see, okay, well, what's actually in stock? And then, you know, probably my whoever took me there, like my mom or my dad or whoever, had maybe given me like a price limit, like you only can't get anything that's over, you know, $39.99. And so you were looking at that, and then you're trying to judge all these games like based on their box art, or maybe you've heard of the game, maybe you saw a commercial on TV. Like I didn't have access to like video game magazines, although in the early days, at the time period we're talking about now, there really weren't any game magazines. And so I really had nothing to go on. Like I just went to the store and was just like trying to pick something to the best of my ability. And whenever it is that you finally made your decision, which was usually rushed because, you know, your parent or whoever was like, come on, just pick something, let's go. You know, and for you, this was like, at least for me, because it was a rare occurrence to get a game, like this was a big decision. Like, don't rush me because I don't want to screw this up, you know, but you know how it is when you're a kid, like, come on, hurry up, I want to get out of here. And so you just end up like, oh, I'll take that one, you know, and you grab the slip. And then the way it would work is you would take that slip up to the register, they would pay for it, and then the cashier would take that slip and staple a receipt to it and hand it back to you. And then you had to go over all the way, like right in the front of the store was like the video game cage, and it was like literally a cage. And it had like a service window, and there was like somebody inside the cage. And so you would go up and you'd hand them your little stapled 2 pieces of paper deal, and they could look at that and say, okay, let me get your game real quick. And like behind them on the wall was just like shelves full of boxed, you know, brand new games. That's where all the games were. Because this was kind of before, I think, the time, and maybe my memory is wrong, but I think this is before the time where they could just put security tags on everything. And I just remember, you know, that trip home in the car from Toys R Us was like full of hope and promise, because you got a game, at least in my case. Usually I didn't really know a whole lot about the game because I just, you know, made my decision based on whatever I saw. And, you know, you could hope in your mind like, oh, this is going to be a cool game. And then you'd get home and either your hopes would be dashed or hopefully you'd end up with something decent. And the whole point of this episode is that usually my hopes got dashed. And the only thing that kind of drives me nuts is I read off that list in the last episode of Flashback of the games that were out, because this would have been at least probably November of '87 when I got this first game. And, you know, based on that list I read out, there were good games out, but maybe they were out of stock, or I think probably more likely I was given, you know, a price ceiling as far as what I could get. And, you know, any first party game, especially this early in the going, was going to be like $50. And I could totally see somebody saying, well, you can't spend more than 35 or 40 or whatever. And I think with probably all the games I'm going to talk about today, I wouldn't be at all surprised if they were priced lower than first party titles. So this first game that I got I remember my stepmom taking me to Toys R Us, and I picked out this game, and I don't know why I got it. It's not like it was my birthday and it was before Christmas. Maybe it was like an early Christmas present. I don't know. The only thing I can say is that I never liked my stepmom, and she knew it, and she would kind of like oscillate back and forth between kind of maybe not being that nice to me because she knew she wasn't going to get anything back from me really, and then basically trying to bribe me, I guess, to get me to like her. I don't really know. Like, I have a memory. I don't want to get sidetracked, but she picked me up one day from kindergarten and like popped the trunk, and the trunk of the car was full of Masters of the Universe toys, He-Man toys. And it was just because she was trying to just ingratiate herself to me, which I guess is kind of sad in a way, but whatever. So maybe that's how I got this game. I don't know. I went to Toys R Us. I picked out this game. I don't remember playing this in the arcade. It doesn't have good label art, so I don't know what made me pick Elevator Action. And Elevator Action is not a bad game. This was a 1983 Taito arcade game that was ported over to the Nintendo. And I want to briefly talk about this company. If you watched the video review I did of Ghosts and Goblins on the main channel, I talked about this company, Micronix. And all Micronix did was port other people's games. Like, they were like a contract developer where you could just hire them and say, hey, I want you to port our arcade game to the Nintendo, and they would do it. But the thing is, they did a bad job. I don't remember exactly how I said it in the Ghosts and Goblins episode, but it was something about how like the hallmark of a Micronix game was like buggy visuals or whatever it was, but they did a really poor job. And they are the ones that ported Elevator Action for Taito. But to be honest, like, this is actually, it's a pretty good game. The problem is that I think for me is that it's an arcade game, and I was used to playing games in the arcade, but I was used to going to the arcade and being able to bounce around between all the different machines, like put in a quarter over here and play, and then when you're done, go to a different machine. And so with a game like Elevator Action, where it's just an arcade port, and it's very like one-dimensional, I guess. You know, the point of the game is that, you know, you drop into the top of this building and you're working your way down. You have to go in the red doors and take the whatever files or whatever and make it to the bottom while all these people are shooting at you. And when you get to the bottom, you take off in your car, and then the next level starts, and it's just the exact same thing again, but the building's like a different color and it's harder. But that's it. It's very repetitive, which is, arcade games by their nature are repetitive, but you know, I think that getting a Nintendo and playing Super Mario Brothers and Zelda sort of like changed the gaming paradigm for me, because it showed me what was kind of possible once you got away from the arcade. So that's it, Elevator Action. Like I said, not a bad game, but it didn't get played a lot. And I remember specifically actually sitting in the living room playing this game and having my stepmom, this is why it's not why I didn't like her, but you know, complaining to me about the music. Like, well, what is that? I'm like, that's the game music. That's not music. And it's just like, okay, you know, whatever. And then I guess quickly to wrap up the thing about Micronix. So I made like a list of the games that Micronix ported to the NES. They ported 10 games or created 10 games, and 3 of the 4 games I'm going to talk about are Micronix games. Like, what are the chances of that happening? So that kind of sucks. So this next game is also a Micronix game, and I never played this in the arcade, but just looking at the label art, I know exactly why I bought this game. And that game is Ikari Warriors. And I'll put up a better picture of the box art there. But, I mean, just look at it. You know, you've got these 2 guys, Ralph and Clark, and they basically both look like Rambo. They're going through the jungle, and, you know, they both have, like, sweet headbands on. They're both ripped. They're both carrying Uzis. And, you know, there's like enemies behind them. There's a tank. And then maybe more importantly, the label here and the box art also says 2 can play together. And I think probably at this time I was still thinking like, hey, I can get this and maybe play with my dad, or like friends come over and I can play with them. I can't fault myself at all really for getting this game, because like the box looked sweet, the artwork looked sweet. Certainly the prospect of playing 2 players simultaneous was pretty sweet. And Like I said, I never played that game in the arcade, but if I had, that would just further make me want to get this game, because in the arcade it was a cool game. Now in the arcade it had like specialized controls, and I remember I kind of talked about this in the Sega Genesis in 1989 episode when I was talking about Forgotten Worlds, where you could spin the joystick, and you could do the same thing here. So you use the joystick and you could move your dudes around, but then you could turn the joystick and that would turn your guy around, which is kind of important for the way this game plays. But when you fire this game up, if you play any Micronix game, the graphics were really never pushing the ability of the Nintendo at all. Like they didn't really even look like Nintendo games. Like the Nintendo could do way better than what Micronix was able to get out of it. And on top of that, like this game, the flicker is really bad, and it's a very bad game, and it's also really buggy. And I have this memory of playing this game with my friend Steven. So I used to live across the street from like this older couple who had this grandson, Steven, and he would come over like every weekend and spend the weekend at their house. And he was my age, and he'd bring his Nintendo. And so I'd go over there, and we'd play my games, we'd play his games. It gave me a chance to play his games and him a chance to play my games. We played Ikari Warriors because it was 2-player simultaneous. And I don't know if this is just me thinking back to being 10 or 11 years old when, everything seemed, when you're a kid, everything seems bigger, everything seems like it takes longer. But I remember us playing Ikari Warriors for a long time because we used the cheat code. It had this, if you got game over, if you right away just hit ABBA, you would just respawn and get basically a new set of lives. We were sitting there and we just kept ABBAing it, and we got what felt like it was really far into the game. Like I remember us thinking, like, is this game we have to be getting close to the end. And then there was some glitch where one of us got stuck, and we had no choice but to just turn the game off. And I think that was one of the last times I ever played Ikari Warriors, because it was just like, it's bad enough that it's glitchy and it's hard and I don't like it. But then when that happens, like, that's unforgivable. In the spring, so this would be the spring of '88, I had my uncle and my cousin come visit, and they lived in New York. And one of the things they did was take me to Toys R Us. And before I get to the two games I got, they also got me this thing. It was called the Mad Scientist Monster Lab. And I'm gonna play a commercial for it real quick.
It's finished. I've created the Monster Lab, and it's too gross. First, you put monster flesh on their creepy little bones. Then pour flesh remover into the Monster Lab and bubble off their flab. Too yucky.
Look at this nasty guy.
The Monster Lab.
So I don't know if any of you remember that, or I don't know how popular of a toy it was, but it's funny because I haven't really seen or thought of that thing in a long time, but it came back to my memory just based on doing this. And I watched that commercial, and I swear to you, just seeing them put that skin on, I could smell it. Like 30 years later, I still, in my brain, that stuff had this really unique, I'm not saying it smelled good, just had a unique smell to it. But anyway, so we went to Toys R Us, they got me that, and then they each told me to pick out a Nintendo game. So I got 2 Nintendo games. So should have been awesome, but Micronix strikes again. This game I got really on name recognition. I never had an Atari growing up, but around this time I had a friend who still had an Atari 2600. He didn't have a Nintendo. One of the games he had was Pitfall, and of course Pitfall and Pitfall 2 were great games. And so when I saw this game, it was like name recognition, like, ooh, Pitfall, that should be a good game. And so hopefully you know what's coming, Super Pitfall. And this was a game that was originally released on the Famicom and the NEC PC 8800. I thought it was going to be a cool game. I thought it was just going to be more Pitfall, and it sounded like it would have been cool. And really, in theory, like on paper, this should have been a cool game. This game is more like Pitfall 2, where it's like open world, I guess, if you want to call it that. Like you have like the run of the place, and you're supposed to go collect all these little things, and then you have to go save. Like there's a lion in a cage you have to go save, and and then you go save your girlfriend or whatever. I don't really want to spend too much time bagging on the game because it's not a YouTube channel. They do it like for charity. It's called like I'm probably saying it wrong. It's like Bad Games Done Quickly or something like that, where he beats the game in like 8 minutes or something, and he really gives you like a rundown of why the game sucks. So I don't really want to go through it too much. It's probably the buggiest game I've ever played in my life. It plays like it's like an alpha build of a game. The graphical glitches are crazy. Like the scrolling is terrible. The frame rate is terrible. There are just like tons and tons of opportunities in this game to die where you had no way of seeing it coming. Like it's just, you have to just die, and that way you know you can't go down that ladder or whatever anymore. And then like the objectives in the game are completely unclear and unreasonable. Like you have to collect these little symbols. They're like the suits of playing cards, and you have to collect each one. But it's like you have to go to a certain spot and stand there and then just jump, and then it appears. And like you'd have no way of knowing you were supposed to do that. You know, I used to sit there and just, you know, feebly try to play the game with no idea what I was really supposed to be doing. And the game, it just had a lot of potential. If somebody had taken that concept of like, oh, I'm gonna make like this open world underground game where you have to go collect all these things, and it was a really good idea. You know, it was just done so poorly, but I could imagine if a game like that had been made by a good developer, it could have been a really cool game. It just wasn't. So on the same day I got that game, I got this next game. This was actually, I think this was the very first episode of Classic Gaming Quarterly when I talked about this game. And that is Town & Country Surf Designs Wood and Water Rage. And the reason I bought this game was if you weren't around in the 80s, you're not going to know what I'm talking about, I guess. But you know, in the 80s, like skate culture and surfer culture were very popular. You know, like it's what all the kids at school, like you wanted to dress like Steve Caballero or Tony Hawk or whatever, or you wanted to dress like, you know, like I don't know any famous surfers, but so generally what we wore is you wore like t-shirts that had like surf or skate branding on them. And then, you know, Vans are still popular, but Vans were very popular because they're skateboarding shoes. And so this company, T&C Surf Designs, they're this Hawaiian company. They're still around today. They make surfboards. And in like 84, they hooked up with this guy named Steve Nazar, who's basically like a cartoonist or a cartoon style artist. And he's still around today. He's still active. And they asked him to design them some characters that they wanted to use in their branding. And he came up with Thrilla Gorilla, Caveman, who isn't in this game, and Joe Cool. And Tiki Man is also in this. Tiki Man and Cool Cat are the other two characters in this game, but I know Tiki Man they already had, and I don't know where Cool Cat came from. But anyway, the point is they sold t-shirts, and then the back would have like a Steve Nazar cartoon with like Thrilla Gorilla or one of the other guys or multiple guys. And those were like really cool t-shirts. And I always wanted one of those t-shirts. I finally ended up getting like one that I just wore to death. That was really the whole reason that I got this game, was I was like, oh, TNC. And it's actually a pretty good game. Micronix did not make this game. This was released by LJN. I can't tell you off the top of my head who developed it though. LJN didn't develop anything ever. They were just a publisher. Like they would just buy the rights to whatever. Like most LJN games were licensed games. Like they would buy the license or whatever, and then they would contract out the work to somebody like Micronix, but not Micronix. And so that's what they did here with this game. And this is actually, it's a decent game. Like I hated it when I was a kid because I was terrible at it and I didn't understand it. But I've kind of grown to appreciate it. Like it's not as bad as I thought it was. And I think a lot of people will have a negative opinion of the game, but if you really spend a little bit more time with it and just sort of accept it for what it is, you know, this would have been a good, to bring out my phrase, this would have been a really good weekend rental, especially if it had like proper instructions. The skating part, so it's Wood and Water Rage because it's skating and surfing. We were all posers because most of us didn't even have skateboards, much less know how to ride them. But The skating part was pretty straightforward. Like, you're just skating from left to right, dodging. Like, there's obstacles you have to dodge, you have to ollie over things. You're really just playing for high score. I'm not going to go into all the mechanics of the game because you can go... actually, you know what? A really good video, if you're interested in watching this game and getting some tips, there's this YouTube channel where the guy's called Benevolent Dick, and he actually has a video about this game giving you like tips on how to play it that will make you appreciate it more, because the real problem with this game is the surfing, but I'll get to that in a second. But you can either play just the skating or just the surfing, or you can play Wood and Water Rage, which is where you go back and forth between the two, and it just progressively gets harder. But it gets a little repetitive. Like, the skating level doesn't really change. Like, it would have been cooler if they had changed like the locales. Like, you're basically on what looks like a boardwalk, like a beach boardwalk, which is cool. But how much more work would it have been for them to say, okay, that level 1's a boardwalk, and then maybe level 2's a city street, and level 3 takes place in a park, or, you know, in the neighborhood down the sidewalk, or just whatever. Like, they could have so easily added a little bit more variety to the game, and they didn't. But the skating, I think, is pretty fun. Where I got hung up when I was a kid is on the surfing. And that's because you really have no idea what you're supposed to do. And it actually wasn't until I made the video that ended up being the first video of Classic Gaming Quarterly that I really got any idea of what I was supposed to do in the surfing. Because with the skating, the idea is to get to the end of the level. And it's obvious that that's what you're supposed to do. With the surfing, it's just you're on this wave, and there's with the pipeline or whatever that you don't want to go too far inside. But other than just trying to stay up and not get, hit by a seagull or whatever, it's not really clear what to do. But the thing is, what you're supposed to do, and what you don't realize, is that the whole time you're moving towards the beach, but you don't know that. And so if you manage to stay up or not lose all your lives, at some point you get to the beach, and then that's how you finish the level. But it was never obvious to me. Like, when I was a kid, not once did I ever get to the beach, because it wasn't even clear to me that's what I was supposed to do. And there's like tricks you can do, like you can jump off the top of the wave, and like if you go inside the pipeline a little bit, you get points just for going in there. There's different ways to get points. I mean, ultimately the game is all about getting points, obviously. But the surfing's just a lot more nuanced, but there's definitely stuff that you can do. It's just the manual doesn't tell you that. And so when I was a kid, I didn't know what I was supposed to do with the surfing, and so I used to just do the skateboarding. I wouldn't do Wood and Water Rage. I would just do the skateboarding levels. If you fall off the skateboard, like, especially if you hit something and the skateboard stops, and then you like endo over whatever it is you hit, and you just like scrape along the sidewalk or whatever, and like the sound it makes is like rubbing sandpaper, and it's just like, oh. Again, the game is really repetitive. It's really an arcade style game, and so when I was a kid, it was just something that I really couldn't sink my teeth into, which I guess is what I was looking for. And really, that's a common theme with these 4 games, is the only game really out of these 4 that theoretically you should be able to sink your teeth into is Super Pitfall, but the game is such a train wreck that you really can't. So, at this point now, I've got 6 games. I have Super Mario Brothers, Legend of Zelda, and then these 4. So obviously, I'm still just going back to Super Mario Brothers and Legend of Zelda. I was in 5th grade. I think I erroneously said I was in 4th grade during this. I wasn't. I was in 5th grade. At the end of 5th grade, I moved and went back to live with my mom, which meant I was back to living down the street from Jonathan, who was sitting on like a king's ransom of Nintendo games. And so I'm actually going to end up talking about quite a few of his games, because I have at least as strong a memories of playing his games as I do of playing my own, and because he had a great collection. So before we get to that, though, there are 2 more games that we're going to cover from the time period when I was still in 5th grade and living with my dad. And neither of these were games that I owned, but one of them was a game that I was able to borrow from somebody, and then we'll talk about the sort of the politics of borrowing games back then. And the other game was just a game where I used to go over to this kid's house every day after school and play with him. And they're both, I'm not going to spoil it, they're both marquee titles for the Nintendo. So thanks for watching. I don't know when the next episode will be up, because I think this is probably, I really want to finish the N64 episode. I have a couple other shorter episodes that I would like to do for this channel that I might do before the N64 is done. I'm not really sure, but probably the last episode of Flashback until that episode comes out. So thanks for watching as always, and we'll see you next time.